everybody, thank you for coming to our Authors At Talk. Today we have Gregory Peck. Garrett, Garrett Peck. I was thinking about after. So today we have Garrett Peck. He's an analyst at a large telecom company, a freelance journalist for the alcoholic beverage industry. He lives in Washington, D.C., where he leads temperance tours of prohibition-related sites in our nation's capitals. This Prohibition Hangover is his very first book. It was 6 years in the making and is a compilation of over 100 interviews in the field. So now, welcome Garrett Peck.
Thanks, Sasha. Hey everyone, hi, I'm Garrett Peck, and like Tasha said here, the book is The Prohibition Hangover, which came out September 1st, so just almost 2 months ago. Like she said, it was about a 6-year process of getting the book to market, so I wanted to kind of talk about what it was like being a first-time author, getting a book out, because it was sort of like I learned the whole process completely backwards, and yet somehow it didn't kill me, and it's kind of a humorous process. And then talked about where the idea for the book actually came, and I'll talk about some of the historic things that led to where we are today with alcohol. So, again, the book is The Prohibition Hangover, Alcohol in America from Demon Rum to Cult Cabernet. So it's kind of signifying that there's been a process, right, from how we once demonized alcohol to where we are today, where most of us drink, and we'll talk about that here throughout this afternoon. I should say here, the last book that covered Americans and alcohol, like a really significant social book about how Americans drink, was written 30 years ago, and that was by an author named William Rohrbaugh. He's a professor at the University of Washington, and the book was called The Alcoholic Republic. And in that book, he laid out where the temperance movement came from. Y'all remember we had Prohibition in this country for nearly 14 years, from 1920 to 1933. Prohibition itself was a century-long movement beforehand that led up to Prohibition, and this was a social reform movement. And just to kind of kick things off here, I'd like to have a little interaction with the audience, and mostly pretty young people here today. So wanted to ask how many of you here can define what temperance was? One person, cool. Yes?
It was a movement that drinking was evil.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I know about it.
Exactly, yeah. They stigmatized alcohol drinking. You kind of think the word temperance means to be temperate or to moderate, right? But they took it to another extreme. They took it to everyone needs to abstain altogether from alcohol. This started off actually with a huge whiskey binge that was going on in the early American Republic. And as a result, the churches said, you know what, we've got a big social problem here. We've got to deal with this. So initially temperance meant to get people to moderate their drinking, but pretty quickly more radical people took over the movement, and they decided that people had to refrain from drinking altogether. So temperance therefore became synonymous with abstinence from alcohol, and we still see that in some places here in America. So in kind of building my platform for the book itself, one of the things I did, like Tasha said, I became kind of a freelance journalist. I wrote the book first, and then it was like, okay, I want to go out there and sell it, which is not generally how you write nonfiction. You generally write a proposal, then you get an agent, then you sell it, and then they give you an advance, and then you go write the rest. So I did the whole process kind of backwards. I wrote it first, and then tried to go out there and sell it. And the answer I kept getting back was, well, dude, you don't have a platform. You work in telecom, so you haven't written in the industry at all, in the alcohol industry. So at that point, then I started doing freelance journalism. So I do about an article a month or so, and I started doing this temperance tour, this historic walking tour of prohibition-related sites in Washington, D.C. So if you guys are ever out there, it's a really fun tour. We see some really unusual sites. The one I put up here on the screen is the Cogswell Temperance Fountain. Anybody ever hear of Henry Cogswell? He was a San Francisco dentist who made his money during the gold rush and part of the temperance movement. And he financed about 50 of these statues. There's only a handful of them left around the country. One in Washington, D.C., this is the one here from D.C., and then one in New York City in Tompkins Square Park in Alphabet City, in the East Village. There's only a handful left. Most of them have been torn down since then, but they were put in very strategic spots around the country to basically signify to the population, drink water instead of whiskey, or drink, like the one in New York City was, it was put in Little Germany, a little neighborhood full of Germans, so the message was drink water instead of beer. So really the point, it was part of the abstinence-only movement at that time. So again, temperance was this faith-based initiative. This was the evangelical, other than abolitionism, the fight to ban slavery in the country. This was the other big social reform movement of the 19th century. So the evangelical Protestant churches banded together and decided they needed to do something about the heavy drinking that was going on, and then ultimately decided that people had to stop drinking altogether. And that ultimately, of course, led it to Prohibition. One of the things they questioned was, what would Jesus drink? And they went through the Bible and reinterpreted the Bible. We call this revisionism, but they decided that because they were teetotalers, therefore Jesus had to be one as well. And actually I grew up hearing this in my own church, whereby they would say, okay, in Jesus' time he drank unfermented wine. They had no scientific basis for that, nor archaeological or biblical basis for it, but it was simply just taken on faith that Jesus didn't drink, even though wine is written in every single chapter of the Bible other than the book of Jonah. And certainly there was lots of evidence around Jesus that in fact he did drink. I mean, turning water into wine at the wedding party at Cana, and a few other cases, Last Supper and so on. So those people who are Catholics scratch their heads and go, what is up with you Protestants? But this was a Protestant movement, and they were the ones who gave us temperance and abstinence, and therefore they had to have a theological or ideological basis really behind it. And ultimately, of course, that's where they gave us the phrase demon rum, which is part of the subtitle of my book. They demonized drinking. I mean, not just to the point of saying, gee, we don't want you to drink, or you should drink less, or moderate. They heavily stigmatized anybody who did drink, and you still see that across the country in a couple places, especially in the Deep South, where you tend to have still conservative churches, predominantly the Southern Baptist Convention, and they still, of course, preach against the evils of alcohol. I put up this here as well. Here, anybody here the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU? One person. So the WCTU was once a super powerful lobby in this country. It was once numbered 600,000 people in the country, all women, and they were headquartered in Illinois. And they put these fountains around. The particular one here you see on the screen is in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, but there was one in Santa Rosa, there's one in Petaluma, still exists, and a few other places. Again, kind of the message, drink water instead of whiskey or beer or wine or whatever your alcoholic beverage choice is. Don't drink it, and drink water instead. So this was a really powerful lobby. The women didn't have the vote yet at the time, and so one of the things they could do was educate people, and hence they got into the classrooms and they educated people on the evils of alcohol drinking. One of the interesting things that came up about in the 1870s, the WCTU arose, and they ended up having an alliance together with the suffragettes. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. The suffragettes was actually a much smaller organization and a much smaller movement, but the movement to get women the vote realized that if they ever wanted to get the vote, they were going to need to ally together with the temperance people. And so those two forces then got together, and therefore it was not a coincidence at all that women got the vote and we banned alcohol in the same year, in 1920. That's not a coincidence whatsoever, right? And then of course once the 1920s came and that alliance and split apart, women decided that in fact that they had earned a right at the speakeasy in the bar, and women started drinking. Kind of unusual, but we'll get into that in a few minutes. So. All right, so we got Prohibition, 1920 to 1933. It lasted almost 14 years long, and it was a horrible failure. It was 13 awful years, as H.L. Mencken called it. He was the Bard of Baltimore. So a vast amount of civil disobedience that took place during this time. How we got into Prohibition in the first place, there was a group called the Anti-Saloon League, and they used the occasion of World War I to change the Constitution. We had declared war against who in 1917?
Germany?
Germany, exactly. And who were most of the brewers in the country at the time?
I suppose Germans?
Yeah, German Americans, indeed. They were the biggest ethnic group at the time in the country. So today it's Latinos, but back then it was the Germans. So once that whole lobby was basically pushed aside, the ASL decided, okay, we're going to go for the gusto. We're going to change the Constitution. I'm still kind of flabbergasted by that fact. I mean, we changed the Constitution not once, but twice to deal with alcohol. Once to ban it, and then once to make it legal again. I mean, crazy. And in just less than 14 years, the country realized what a huge unintended consequence Prohibition had released. That there was just endemic lawbreaking around the country. There was so much money to be made. Organized crime was making a fortune, and the violence was really, really getting bad around the country. So after 14 years, less than 14 years, the country decided, okay, let's go back the way it was before, and let's regulate it now this time. So anybody here has ever seen this? This is one of the most famous photos here from Prohibition itself, and if there's any beer drinkers in the room, you probably want to cry. This is in 1921, and Yes, they're pouring beer into the sewer. So kind of a publicity stunt, but one of the more famous photos from Prohibition. The dry cause itself had really thought, I think naively, that the country would simply just dry up. If we ban the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, the country will simply just obey the law and people will stop drinking. And I think they were really naive to believe that because it's really been fundamentally a part of American culture since the beginning. And for example, I talked about the movement of women splitting apart in the 1920s. You got this younger generation of women who came up, they now had the vote, they decided they had a right at the speakeasy, the right to drink. Back then, drinking was a man's sport. And come the 1920s, okay, it's illegal for everybody to drink, so therefore we can all drink, right? So women start going out to the speakeasies as well, they start bootlegging. They do some really unusual things in the 1920s. Remember, this is the era of Sigmund Freud. So people start doing, psychoanalysis and, start to see your shrink and so on. Women start to smoke in the 1920s. They hadn't done that before. They start to drink in the 1920s. And you see, for example, this woman right here, she has her garter and her hip flask. Breaking the law suddenly looks pretty glamorous, right? So this law breaking became endemic to American society. Okay, we had the law of the land that says you can't manufacture, sell or transport alcohol, and yet everyone's doing it regardless. So really the country became very cynical towards Prohibition itself. But actually changing the law back is pretty difficult. Getting a constitutional amendment isn't easy in this country, right? You got to get 2/3 of the Congress to vote for it, and then you got to get 3/4 of the states to vote for it. But that said, of course, we changed the Constitution twice. So the first time we used the occasion of World War I to change the Constitution, the crisis, and then we had a second crisis. So what was that? Anyone? Great Depression, exactly. The economy fell off a cliff in October 1929. And with that came a huge political change in the country. It's very similar to what happened in 2006 and 2008, actually. The 1920s belonged to the Republican Party, all 3 presidencies and both houses of Congress. And in 1930 and 1932, the whole country just shifted over completely. And the Democrats ran on a platform of repeal. In other words, let's get this problem under control. We'll have law and order again to control the endemic law breaking that's going on. And so Franklin Delano Roosevelt runs on a platform of repeal. So not that we're happy about legalizing alcohol again, but rather we can get the beast under control and now we can regulate it. So the 21st Amendment gets passed through Congress in January of 1933, so before FDR was even in office. The first state votes for it in March of 1933. Anybody from Michigan? Your state voted first. Woo! Congratulations, Tasha. And then the 36th state, the one that pushed it over the top, was 9 months later, which shows you how much the country wanted an end to the noble experiment. And that was December 5th, 1933. What state was that? No one knows. What state in this country would you think people would least likely to drink in? Utah. Utah was the 36 states. Yeah, it became kind of a badge of honor that they would be the ones here to push the measure over the top. And so yeah, that became then the end of Prohibition itself. The 21st Amendment, of course, promised the country regulation of alcohol and control of alcohol. And so we'll talk about that here a little bit here this afternoon. What I want to talk about here with my book, this is kind of a precursor of how we got into the mess and out of Prohibition itself. With my book here, if I can really quickly here just give you a quick read. 2 paragraphs, if you'll let me indulge. To look at what happened after Prohibition. And that's really my thesis of what happened over these last 76 years since we changed the law back. So just quick 2 paragraphs here. The United States has had a tense relationship with alcohol since colonial times, and even after Prohibition failed, Americans are still unsure how to deal with it. Our social attitudes and laws on alcohol are disjointed. Is it a normal consumer product? Is it a controlled substance? Is it a gift from God, or is it demon rum? Now maybe it's all of these things. As Americans drink more, there's a great strain between the many differing points of view about alcohol, between freedom and reform, tipplers and teetotalers, evangelicals and secularists. But at least this is not a political issue anymore. Republicans are just as likely to drink as Democrats. Now the other paragraph I want to read here is kind of the epiphany moment when I had their eureka. Oh my gosh, I got a book here I need to go write. So everybody asks the question, well, where did you come up with this idea? So here it is. This book came about from an insight over a Christmas dinner in 2003. My mom, grandmother, and I were gathered around the table for roast beast, which is what we call it since the Grinch Who Stole Christmas. I opened a nice 1997 Burgundy. 3 generations sat at the table. My grandmother, who grew up during Prohibition and had an alcoholic husband, and my mom and me, both social drinkers. What explains the shift between abstinence and social drinking within a single family? Why did people abstain in the first place? And why weren't these generational values passed on? That was sort of the eureka moment. I thought, wow, what happened here? I need to go explore this question here. And once I got into my research, then kind of discovered, wow, no one's written a book at all about what happened to Americans after Prohibition. How did we get to a country, again, where most of us drink? So in a single slide here, this always gets a couple laughs here, really wanted to lay out, how we went from a country that once heavily stigmatized alcohol, and these are women here from the Women's Christian Temperance Union, to one where we are today where 2/3 of us drink alcohol, and alcohol is really kind of glamorized now. People here, you can ask around the room here, this is mostly a young audience, so probably most people probably do drink. How many of you are into single malt scotches or into Pinot Noirs that are grown in these tiny little vineyards, but like Miles and Sideways that are fanatics about that, or I call that the cult Cabernet phenomenon. And there's the or people are into 90-minute IPAs and so on. People are really knowledgeable now about what they drink, and we kind of glorify it now, and people get kind of nerdy about we get a room of craft beer drinkers together, and people just have so much to discuss, about what their favorite beers are. Do they like it rather with hops or rather with malt, or and so on. So yeah, we've really made a huge transition over these last 76 years to where the point now where the stigma is largely gone in American society. In fact, I think we are, in fact, a drinking nation once again. So this is one of the few academic slides I'll put here in today's presentation, but this is really interesting here. This is the Gallup Survey. They've done this survey almost every year since 1939. There's a couple gaps during World War II and so on. But yeah, it really shows the case of 2/3 of American adults, 18 and older, drink alcohol. That's pretty significant. And the survey they took this year here in 2009 was 64%, versus the other 36% who abstain. So clearly not every American drinks, and nor should every single American drink. There's lots of good reasons not to drink alcohol. But most of us do, right? And that's a significant shift right there, as most of us, I think, recognize, yeah, it's just a part of our lives and our lifestyles here now. That said, of course, the temperance movement kind of lingered on, even to the 1950s or even later. Like I said, you still see it in some parts of the country, especially the Deep South, and a few other places where you still have dry towns. If any of you heard of dry counties, but they still exist in a few places, especially the Deep South and the Midwest, and a few places in Massachusetts still are dry towns, amazingly. But yeah, there was this lingering social stigma against alcohol, especially as the WCTU, which still exists actually, they've really waned in power. The stigma here really existed at least into the 1950s, and a lot of people were still concerned that they might come back and try to have another round with Prohibition. And I think simply the World War II generation that went out, they fought the war, they all mostly became drinkers. They drank beer, that generation. And they had moved on at that point. They grew up during Prohibition. They were like, let's not fight this issue again, it's a losing issue. And so by the 1960s, y'all have seen Mad Men, right? Mm-hmm. Most people watch Mad Men, so or you can get on Netflix if you haven't. So, but wow, heavy amount of drinking in the office, especially scotch, and smoking. But yeah, so that generation just became a generation of drinkers, and just decided, okay, we're going to drink. There's really no more stigma around alcohol anymore for them. There's still, of course, a legacy within the country of alcohol. Part of the promise of the 21st Amendment was it was going to give states control over alcohol, the ability to regulate alcohol. Now, are all of you here Californians, or you come from different places? I'm from Oregon. You're from Oregon?
New York, Massachusetts.
Massachusetts, so yeah, so you've seen dry counties and dry lodging in a few places.
Yeah, I was living there in the 70s, 80s, where they still had Blue Laws, couldn't sell alcohol on Sundays.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and you still see them in some weird places around the country. Still blue laws, still a few Sunday closing laws, and so on. So it's kind of a legacy of Prohibition itself. The slide you see here is my liquor store right down the street from me. ABC is Alcoholic Beverage Control. I live in Virginia, so right across the border from Washington, D.C. In Arlington County, we have 6 liquor stores for the entire county of 200,000 people. Whereas you go across the border into Washington, D.C. and 500,000 people, and they have over 500 liquor stores. So 1 for every 1,000 people. Just this, huge discrepancy. The whole state of Virginia has 300 liquor stores for the entire state. So, but it's what's called a control state. California is one of the more liberalized states because you can actually go to a grocery store and buy distilled spirits, but most states you can't. Louisiana is another key one. So you go to New Orleans and you can get a to-go cup with you, or go to a drive-through liquor store, so, which is always kind of funny. So, and yeah, like you mentioned here, blue laws still exist in some places. They're kind of fading out of the way. There's still dry counties around this country, but with every recession, they start to kind of get knocked off one by one. It's harder and harder to justify having a dry county. Dry counties, by the way, came from the run-up to Prohibition. Back when the Anti-Saloon League was trying to force the country to go dry, they established local option laws allowing counties to go dry, and therefore they could pressure, and this is where their evangelical allies were, especially out in the rural areas. They could then push the state to go dry. And for example, little Davis up the road here, an hour and a half, was once a dry town. And now it's this, it's got the Department of Viticulture and Enology, but that was once a dry town. There's microbreweries there now and stuff, but 30 years ago, it was dry. I think the university there really changed the culture of the city itself, and you've got people who are into the cult Cabernet phenomenon. But yeah, right there you see how even one little town here shifted over time to become a drinking town again, when it once had a culture of alcohol is wrong and don't do it, right? So gradually here, especially like you see this here during recessions such as now, dry counties really have a hard time justifying themselves anymore. For example, if you look at how restaurants make their money, no restaurant in this world practically can exist other than McDonald's without selling alcohol. It's just a fundamental part of how they stay open, is they have to be able to sell beer or wine. And if they don't do it, then you won't have a restaurant in that town. And if you don't have restaurants, well then you're not going to get the tourists, right? Because tourists are going to go places where they can eat. And if you don't get the tourists, then you don't get the hotels. So there's this whole spillover effect from allowing alcohol that generates tourist dollars. And that's a huge issue for a lot of places now. For example, we talked about Utah here a couple minutes ago. Utah, just this last year, anybody hear of the Zion's Curtain Law? Yeah. Zion's Curtain, this was established in 1933 or 1934, and right after Prohibition ended. And they literally put up a curtain, a barrier, between the bar and the customer. So you couldn't actually interact with the bartender, and you couldn't watch them make your drink, right? And that existed all the way until last year. And most people in Utah are Mormon. But even the Utah legislature finally realized they get a huge proportion of the revenue from tourism. They finally realized, okay, this makes us look a little bit backwards, putting a curtain around the bar, like, oh, it's so wrong to see the bartender make your drink, So they actually repealed the Zion's Curtain Law last year, and just to kind of catch up with where the times are. Kind of recognizing, okay, let's get to where people actually are in alcohol now. This is really interesting. This is the American drinking pattern on alcohol. I don't think this is necessarily a healthy model, but this is how we drink. The average age for most kids had their first drink in America between 12 and 13. And a few people here nodding their heads saying, oh yeah. 16 for me, but I may have had a sip of beer at some point when I was really young, but I don't remember it. But then there's this huge spike. By the time kids leave high school, they're already binge drinking. So in a matter of a couple of short years, they adopt alcohol and then they overuse it. And then they go off to college and it gets even worse. And so we have this huge binge drinking culture, especially in colleges and universities and college campuses. And colleges are really trying to drive the problem off the campus through heavy enforcement, so similar to Prohibition. And largely what they're doing is just pushing the drinking off campus, where it becomes an even bigger problem because it's now not monitored anymore, right? So the problem just gets worse and worse, and more students are dying because of binge drinking. And then gradually over the years, then Americans learn, okay, you know what, you can't live your life binge drinking. That's just crazy, And so we all learn kind of how to moderate our drinking over time. You learn, when you're young, when you're in college, getting drunk might be the thing that you want to do. And then you get to, some point in your mid to late 20s or something, and you realize, okay, I'm 41 years old. I don't drink anymore to get drunk. It's not that's not why I drink. I drink more for the experience of how it goes with food, for the conviviality of being with your friends and socializing, and how it sort of, gets people to talk a little bit better. But you can do that with 1 or 2 drinks, right? You don't necessarily have to get smashed, So it becomes much more about the experience and about the taste. So kind of what we drink kind of changes over time here based on what your personal preferences are or how you use alcohol in your own personal life over time. So again, we kind of moderate our habits over our lifetimes. This is a vastly different model from how most European countries raise their kids, or how within this country, how Jewish families raise their kids, whereby it's just, they learn how to drink at the dinner table, right? As little kids, if you come from a Jewish family, every Friday night you have the Shabbat dinner, and even little kids get a small glass of wine. It's just part of the experience, and so it's normalized. And as a result, you don't see the same binge drinking behavior in most European countries or most Jewish families here within the United States. So there are a couple exceptions to that. In Europe, UK has a big binge drinking problem. It's worse than the United States itself. But other than that, it's Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the other big countries where they all have big alcohol cultures, and yet they drink more than we do, and yet vastly lower rates of binge drinking. Right? It's much more to do with socializing and with food. Right? That's why you go to Italy and everybody has a glass of wine with every meal, and that's how they drink. So it's a vastly different culture altogether than Americans are. We sort of had to learn moderation after we made all of our mistakes, and then gradually we learn how to control our drinking and how to enjoy it and to drink for more of the experience. And then talking as well here about the always contentious issue, the drinking age itself. Remember, 25 years ago we shifted up the drinking age from 18 up to 21, and that was largely thanks to Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They did that, of course, to save lives of young adults who were being killed on car accidents through drinking and driving. And in some ways, I think we simply just kicked the can down the road. You see the group that has the biggest group that both binge drinks and also has the most amount of prevalence of drunk driving accidents are the 21 to 25-year-olds. And gradually then that comes down, significantly comes down over time. But yeah, we've kind of created this forbidden fruit thing with our young adults by telling them that they can't drink until they're 21. And of course, they do, right? I mean, anything that you've kind of created a social taboo around, just like during Prohibition, well, they're going to say, you know what, I'm going to go do it anyways, because it's kind of glamorous now to break the law, and so on. So I think our attitude that young people shouldn't drink at all in this country until they're of age, until they're 21, has helped create this binge drinking problem. And by the way here, this kind of shocked me when I learned this fact. Mothers Against Drunk Driving claims that they've saved about 1,000 lives a year by raising the drinking age up to 21. The federal government came back and said, no, it's more like about 900 lives a year. The kind of the unintended consequence, though, of raising the drinking age up to 21 is the last number that we have is from 2005, was that 1,825 students died of binge drinking related causes on campuses and universities. That floored me when I saw that. That's double the number of lives we're actually saving from raising the drinking age. And it's largely because of the unintended consequence of creating the social taboo around alcohol. When I grew up, when I was in high school, we drank wine coolers. Shame to admit that, but we did. And beer, yeah, I think we're the same generation. So 80s, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Wine coolers suck. But it's what we drank, and they were sweet and gross. But you shift over to today's young generation, and where the drinking is so heavily pushed underground, and the students have really shifted over towards distilled spirits, which are much more concentrated. And especially since they can't go to any events where they can drink alcohol. So one of the things they do, for example, anybody hear the term pre-gaming?
Pre-partying.
Yeah, pre-partying, yeah. You basically take your hip flask with you in your stomach. You take a bunch of shots of vodka, and then you head out for the night. And the buzz sets in while you're out, right? So it's very, very dangerous. You can really harm yourself with a small amount of alcohol and really realize how powerful this stuff is. We've also created this Rite of Passage at 21, and anybody hear this or experience this with, when you reach 21, you take 21 shots. Mm-hmm. That's almost an entire fifth. That can kill you. I mean, depending on your size and your tolerance for alcohol, but I mean, that can definitely send you to the hospital. 21 shots of beer, okay, but 21 shots of vodka is something else, right? And that's a Rite of Passage when you hit 21. You gotta go do this, and that's crazy. Like, why would you go kill yourself like that, or potentially, harm yourself? But again, that's part of the whole taboo we've created around alcohol, especially among young adults. Other key contentious issues, I think the drinking age is probably the most contentious issue right now, and it's been going on kind of for 25 years. There's a big discussion around, should we drop it down to 18, and I argue that in the book, actually. We should take another look at it, and I think 21 has created this unintended consequence, and maybe 18 should be the right age, and really push the emphasis back on the parents, have them raise their kids with, how to drink at the dinner table, and learn how to drink responsibly. Because once the kids go off to 18, once they're 18, they go off to college. Personally, I think it's too late, because the alcohol, it's everywhere. I mean, the colleges can try to enforce it, the drinking age, and try to keep the kids from drinking, but it's just too easy for them to get. It's everywhere. They all have friends with fake IDs, or they have other friends who want to buy it for them, and it's just endemic now. And so the problems get worse. Another key issue, I think this one here goes all the way back really to 1933, 1934, is the question of advertising. There are those people who want to stop alcohol advertising altogether, just like they've managed largely to stop tobacco advertising, especially on TV and billboards, that kind of stuff. We'll see where this goes. I think this is largely, especially as a journalist, this is for me a First Amendment issue. Right? Companies need to advertise, and I think ultimately they do have a right to. And certainly pornography is considered to be protected free speech, so why wouldn't alcohol advertising also be considered to be protected free speech, right? Even though it's commercial. You may have noticed here, if you ever go to Candlestick Park, I guess people don't go to baseball games anymore to Candlestick Park, but I'm showing my age since I used to go there. To Packville Park, or is it AT&T Park now? Did they rename it?
It's AT&T.
AT&T Park,
Candlestick is still where the 49ers play.
Okay. You might have noticed how much beer advertising is there. Like any stadium you go around the country, there's so much beer advertising, right? There's a key reason for that. 80% of the beer drunk in this country is drunk by men, and men like sports. It's a really simple formula. That's why they advertise at these venues, and that's why there's such a heavy predominance of beer advertising. And also why you see it if you watch football at home, since the World Series is going on right now, but you always see beer commercials on TV during the time, right? It's for a simple fact, that's what men drink, at least of men of a certain age and up. But yeah, it goes together kind of with the sports, and they know what their niche market is, a very, very large niche market. So yeah, it kind of goes hand in hand together. We all kind of think when we go to a ball game or a hockey game or whatever, let me get a hot dog and have a beer with it. I think we're almost all socially programmed towards that now in American society. There's also this key question here, it's really popped up, at least since the early 1990s, which is, can alcohol actually be healthy? And anybody remember here the 60 Minutes broadcast about the French paradox? It was in 1991, and a few people remember that. And they really laid out the case that, in fact, the French have a high-fat diet, and yet they drink, and they have an astonishingly low rate of heart disease. Even a lot of them smoke. And so that was the French paradox. They realized, okay, it must be the wine, that because they drink so much red wine, that it gives them cardiovascular protection. And as a result, then, especially the baby boom generation, just wholesale jumped over to drinking red wine, and you still see that today. People who are 50 and older drink wine, because they view it as being healthy, and they can also afford it. It tends to be the most expensive of the three types of alcohol, so beer and distilled spirits being the other two. Yeah, so there's been this whole debate over, gosh, can we drink? Is it healthy for us? And yes, it's a kind of a two-sided question, really, or maybe a multifaceted question. Certainly, alcohol can cause harm, absolutely. I mean, if you drink too much, there is alcoholism, and most people don't become alcoholics. That's the thing. And most people learn how to moderate their drinking. But yeah, you can have liver damage from drinking too much alcohol. Women are at heightened risk for breast cancer, and there's a bunch of other things that go along with that. There's also, of course, on the flip side, health benefits from alcohol, predominantly to the cardiovascular system. Alcohol raises your HDL cholesterol, that's the good cholesterol, by 5 to 10%. This is, by the way, for a moderate amount of alcohol. If you drink a lot of alcohol, it can actually damage your heart. But a moderate amount actually gives you significant heart protection. It also thins your blood, which gives you a big protection against strokes. And they're also noticing that for elderly people who drink regularly and moderately, it gives them protection against Alzheimer's. Like somehow it prevents the plaque buildup in old people's brains. So yeah, there are some benefits from a moderate amount of drinking every single day. The public health community is generally against any kind of mention at all of any kind of health benefit whatsoever, because they're really heavily cautioning against it, particularly like the American Medical Association. I've gotten some interesting emails and some interesting exchanges here over the last couple months since the book came out. One, I think this kind of ties so much together with the stigma of alcohol and so on, together with the health issue. I got an email last month from a Assemblies of God minister in Georgetown, Texas. So a small, conservative, evangelical Protestant town in Texas. And this guy here said, and he had preached his whole life long the evils of alcohol, demon rum, all the way, right? Don't drink it, it's bad for you, and so on. However, he had to talk with his doctor, who said, your cholesterol is way too high. Your numbers are off the chart. So you need to start drinking a glass of wine every single day. And so he started doing that. Every night with his wife, he would start to have a glass of wine, and they discovered they enjoyed it. So they had one glass a day. That's all they allowed themselves. And they found, like, wow, this is really, we kind of catch the day much nicer now. We have a nice little discussion at the end of the day. We're having kind of fun testing these different wines and so on. And then he went and told his congregation, and which was just like, wow, he was heavily stigmatized within his own church for telling them, after preaching for years, the evils of alcohol, and now he's saying, okay, you can have a little bit, and actually it's a God-given benefit, right? So among his friends and his congregation, he found there was really a backlash against him for doing that. I also, last week I gave a talk up at Davis, and there was a Methodist minister, and I'm a Methodist today, and I think he kind of misapproached my book. I think he thought my book was going to be about kind of how evil alcohol is, and he talked my ear off for about 10 minutes before my talk began. And I was like, oh boy, we're reading the same data, and yet we're interpreting it completely different. So I'm looking at it and realizing, okay, most of us drink. Here's kind of the synthesis of where we are in America. He's reading the same data and seeing, oh no, harm, damage, wrecked lives, destruction, cancer. People shouldn't drink, right? Raise the drinking age to 25 for all I care, right? And at one point during the talk, he kind of sat in the back row, and it was just this, he kept quiet for most of the time. He asked a couple questions, but it was largely a litany of angry faces he made to me, just sort of like, I was talking kind of about the benefits for alcohol. And I got to the one point where I talked about this minister in Georgetown, Texas, and talked about how many of my friends who are in their 50s or 70s, into their 70s, who have had the talk with their doctor, and the doctor has told them, have a glass of wine every single day for you. It'll be good for you, right? And at that point, the guy in the back shouted out, oh, no, they don't. And I said, yes, they do. Yeah, I think the guy's kind of out of touch with really where Americans are, or maybe he only has friends who know that, in fact, that he's so staunchly anti-alcohol that none of them really confess to him that, in fact, that their doctor told them that it's okay to have a glass of wine once in a while. It's actually good for you to have a moderate amount, So yeah, that's kind of the whole public debate that's going on right now about the health benefits of alcohol itself. Now we look at the cycle of drinking. This is really an interesting thing that's happened since Prohibition. Over these last 76 years, to kind of realize there's always big cycles of drinking itself, of times of when we drink more, then there's always reform. So Mothers Against Drunk Driving formed in 1980, kind of as an outcome of probably the peak of binge drinking was in the 1970s, and that was largely the last big distilled spirits culture in this country. That's back when the men were drinking, rye or bourbon with names like, Old Grandad, Old Forester. The baby boom generation came along and said, we're not going to drink anything with the word old in it, right? So bourbon collapsed at that point, and it's just resurrected over the last decade or so, and they dropped all the words old, and now you've got new products like Woodford Reserve and Jim Beam Black Label and so on. But yeah, so there's always been a cycle. Each generation picks a different drink that they like to drink, and even within a generation, it changes over time. For example, you see the baby boom generation. They started off as being beer drinkers. They looked at their parents who were bourbon drinkers, and they said, we're not doing that. They drank beer throughout the 80s, and then, of course, the French Paradox hit in 60 Minutes in 1991, and they shifted right over to wine, and that's where they're at. You get to our generation, we're Generation Xers, and there's probably a few other Generation Xers, and probably a few millennials here in the room as well. We kind of drink everything. I think beer is our predominant beverage throughout our generation. It's always different by each person. And yeah, we also largely drink wine, and we like cocktails, so we're kind of a blended generation. And you get to the millennials, and they're drinking cocktails. That's what they like. They like vodka, they like tequila. The big drink is Red Bull and vodka, because that way you can go out out to the club and drink a lot and still stay awake. You know, it's the preferred cocktail. You know. Yeah, the benefits of caffeine together with alcohol. Great, right? So yeah, our preferences for alcohol change over time. Like I said, we kind of learn how to moderate our drinking. No one really sticks with the same beverage all their entire lives. And most of you, if you look at your own history, you've probably already kind of seen a little bit of shift in your own lives, haven't you? If you're a drinker, that you kind of shift, and it's a lot of times it's even seasonal, based on, there's probably some people in the room who are foodies, you know, and kind of, okay, you like going to the farmer's market, and then you make whatever's fresh, and then you kind of pair whatever wine or beer goes with it, and then that's different in the summertime than wintertime, where you might open up, you know, big hearty reds to go with your meatloaf or vegan meatloaf or whatever it is that you like to eat, you know. So, you know, so there's always kind of a seasonality, I think, largely where Americans are of kind of pairing our food together with whatever we like to drink, and I think that's actually fairly healthy. The fact we've learned how to make that part of the dining experience, because ultimately then people tend to drink more moderately when it's actually part of a meal versus let's go out to the bar and get drunk together. You know, it's a different experience altogether. So talking about a little bit about the history, especially since we're here in California. California, by the way, makes 90% of the wine in this country. All 50 states have wineries, including Alaska and Hawaii. California, though, makes 90% of the wine in this country. So it's the 800-pound gorilla on the block, right? So most is made right here. California, of course, the wine industry was really decimated by Prohibition itself, and it didn't start to recover into the 1960s. And I kind of chart, that's really where the craft movement really began. So, which coincided together with Julia Child. Remember, if you ever watched any of her shows, she would always hold up a little glass of wine at the end and say, "Bon appetit." You know, really showed Americans how you can not only make good food, but you can pair it with good wine, you know. So people started doing that, you know. People started flying over transatlantic flights over to Europe and realizing, wow, look at the Europeans. They have wine with every meal. Let's do the same, you know. So there was a rising interest in wine in the 1960s, and that's when Napa really started to flourish. And you know, here we are today with the whole baby boom generation that's really embraced wine itself. So that was the 1960s. You kind of fast forward to the end of the 1970s, and Jimmy Carter signed a law allowing home brewing to become legal in 1979. And that really marks charts the beginning of the craft beer phenomenon. And one of the big leaders, there's a lot of the phenomena really started here in California itself, with like New Albion Brewing Company, which has long since gone defunct, but you've had Anchor Steam up in San Francisco, and of course Sierra Nevada. That's been a huge leader here in the craft beer movement. The biggest single craft brewer, though, in the country is Jim Koch, who is the brewer behind the Boston Beer Company, Sam Adams. He's actually the single largest American brewer now, since the big three are all foreign-owned. So Coors, Anheuser-Busch, and Miller are all owned by foreign companies now. And he has less than 1% market share of the entire brewing market. Jim, actually, by the way, was the last person I interviewed for the book. The manuscript was due in 1 week, so September 29th of last year, 2008. I interviewed him, got that last interview in. My editor said, let's beef up the beer chapter just a little bit, so I got him, got his whole story about where he came from and how it became so big. And then a week later, the manuscript was due, so I was very thrilled to be able to introduce him. And it was actually, he was just about to jump on an airplane to fly to Germany to go pick out the hops for that year, so that was the very end of September of last year. One of the other things here, if anybody here is from the Mid-Atlantic, Rolling Rock, I'm sure that you've seen it here in the West Coast as well, but I look at that as sort of an impact within the book of globalization upon a small brewer, and sort of what happens when you can't compete anymore, when your market disappears, or you just can't stomach nationwide advertising. In this case here with Rolling Rock, and the brand itself got bought out by Anheuser-Busch, who didn't want the brewery. So it actually isn't made anymore in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, but now in Newark, right by the airport, Newark International Airport, so by Anheuser-Busch. So yeah, it's kind of interesting to look at small brewers, and if they can compete, and frequently they either have a local niche market for microbrewers, or they can't go national, they get bought out sometimes, and you have unintended consequences that come about from that, from globalization itself. And then finally we get to the liquor market. Distilled spirits, of course, like I said, they hit a wall back in the 1970s, and just in the last decade they've been resurrected. And I kind of chart the beginning of distilled spirits, of the phenomenon, to Sex and the City. So any fans here of the show? You know, the girls on the show really made the Cosmopolitan look popular, like really glamorous. You know, they always used to change their outfits all the time, and then they always have this little pink fruity martini that they drink when they would go out. And Americans kind of caught on to that, like, wow, spirits look really cool, you know. So I kind of chart that as the beginning of the resurrection here for distilled spirits. And you get to today, there's this huge craft cocktail phenomenon going on. So if you go into San Francisco or even local bars where you have these, I call them culinary bartenders, who take their inspiration from the kitchen, right? So they're not just mixing drinks anymore, but now they have to use kitchen skills to like separate eggs and to use, you know, fresh juices and so on. They start putting herbs and spices and stuff like that into cocktails. So there's been this really huge shift. And cocktails, of course, you can do an infinite variety of types of drinks here that you can make. So really a significant shift here that's happened just within the last decade. So it's kind of interesting here to look. You also, of course, have the craft phenomenon going on within distilled spirits itself. They're kind of the last ones that got there, and it's just happened just in the last couple of years. This particular photo right here is Woodford Reserve. I was out there just last month here giving a talk. But yeah, you think the word Woodford Reserve, it sounds like a wine, doesn't it? It's a brand that was created in 1996, and yet they use this old distillery from the early 1800s, and they restored it. It's owned by Brown-Forman, one of the largest alcohol companies out there. And then just in the last couple of years, you start to see kind of small craft distillers that have kind of popped up. There's one, for example, in Alameda that makes absinthe. You know, by and large, most of the companies are making gin or vodka because you don't need to age those. You can make it and then bottle it on the same day, and off to market you go. Whereas like whiskey, you got to age it. It takes years. That's a lot of capital. You got a place to store it and so on. So, but yeah, liquor has been kind of the latecomer here to the craft movement. But yeah, here it is. It's kind of just popping up. So kind of wrapping up my talk here today. You know, we've looked at a lot of different things here, a lot of the key issues that have gone on here in American society, kind of tracing how Americans have shifted over these last 76 years from a country where alcohol was once heavily stigmatized to one where we are today where, yeah, most of us drink, and a lot of people are kind of fanatics about what they drink itself, especially people who, pair food together with their whatever they like to drink. So it's a pretty significant social shift in American society. And I think a lot of ways alcohol, in fact, is fundamental to American society. It was really naive of the temperance movement, especially hindsight, to think that, wow, they actually wanted to ban alcohol, and would Americans actually not drink? I mean, alcohol's been there from the beginning. I mean, literally. I mean, from Jamestown. The first settlers that came to Jamestown, they didn't want to grow tobacco. They ended up with tobacco. They went there to grow grapes so they could challenge the French in Bordeaux. So they were trying to basically break the French monopoly on red wine. It didn't work out that way. Williamsburg and that area is a terrible climate to grow grapes, so it's very humid. So they ended up with tobacco instead. Or in 1620, when the Pilgrims came here, they ended up in Plymouth, but the first place they actually landed was what's now Provincetown, up at the very tip of Cape Cod. And when they came to shore, the first thing they did, they dug a well so they could get water, so they could brew beer. Because that's how you preserved your water back then. It was low alcohol beer, 3 to 4% alcohol. But these people, by the way, were Puritans. People blame Prohibition and on the Puritans, but in fact, the Puritans drink. It wasn't their fault that Prohibition came about, but rather from a movement that came out centuries later. So yeah, alcohol, in fact, really is a fundamental part of American society, and I think the sooner we can recognize that, and the fact that we can sooner recognize that there are in fact benefits from moderate drinking and from socialization that ultimately leads to a better outcome for Americans overall. So I always like to end here with my favorite quote here from Homer Simpson, which is, "To alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems." Alrighty, I'll be glad to take any questions and to answer any questions that you guys have. Back? Yeah.
I grew up in Oklahoma, and they still have like 3.2 beer, I think it is. Mm-hmm. I'd heard at the time that 3.2 during Prohibition was actually non-alcoholic. And I don't tell me if this is incorrect, but I was told that when Prohibition kicked in, a lot of brewers just walked away, said they're out of business. But Oklahoma lowered it to 3.2, which is technically non-beer, maintained it through Prohibition, and then when Prohibition was lifted, Oklahoma just maintained 3.2, and now it's one of just a couple states that have that low percentage.
For the camera, I'll repeat the question just so they can hear in case they didn't record it. He asked about Oklahoma and also 3.2% beer. The Oklahoma question is actually interesting. Not that it actually ever was dry, but constitutionally it was a dry state. And by the way, it went wet in 1959. That wasn't the last state to go wet though. That was Mississippi in 1966. So just a generation ago, really, the last state went wet. The 3.2 question is actually interesting. This was the waning days of how this came about. Was in the waning days of Prohibition. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn in only 2 weeks, and a law got passed called the Cullen Act, and that passed Congress, and Roosevelt signed it on April 6th, 1933. He was in office 2 weeks at that point because presidents were sworn in March. That law declared that 3.2% beer was non-intoxicating. Roosevelt signed that law, and it went into effect at midnight. And I think that's really when Americans realized, okay, Prohibition's over. The first states have already, including Michigan, had already voted for repeal. At that night at midnight, the country took to the streets, and everybody went out and got a beer because it was 3.2% alcohol beer, supposedly non-intoxicating. Therefore, it didn't violate the Volstead Act, which was the Prohibition Enforcement Act. So simply Congress declared 3.2% beer is non-intoxicating. So yeah, so largely we look at April 7th as being sort of the beginning of the end of Prohibition. You know, people went out to the streets that night and celebrated at midnight when they could actually go get a beer. It cost a nickel by then, by the way. And nowadays you go out to a bar and get a pint of beer, it's $5. Other questions?
I was always curious about absinthe and how, like in the U.S., there was rules against absinthe for a lot longer than other types of alcohol. Why the special treatment for absinthe, and is there anything that you learned about that?
Yeah, absinthe actually was made illegal, I think, in 1912.
Okay.
And one of the first types of alcohol that was outlawed altogether. People used to believe, and everybody here has seen Moulin Rouge? Yeah, everybody's nodding, so you know about the Green Fairy.
Yeah.
There was once a belief that absinthe was hallucinogenic, and ultimately they finally proved that it is not. Absinthe became legal again about 2 years ago, 2007, and so you see it pop up in a lot more places now. In fact, it's actually just very, very high in alcohol. It's 55 to 60% alcohol, so it's very, very high. So yeah, that's if you want to get drunk, it's a interesting way to get drunk, so because it's so strong. But but yeah, people once thought it would cause brain damage, it would cause all kinds of bad effects, and be hallucinogenic. So therefore, they outlawed it. France actually outlawed it as well during World War I, 1915. That was more because so many people were shifting over to absinthe, and the wine merchants were getting upset because they were losing a lot of market share. So they made it illegal there as well. And since then, the European Union, just like the United States, has also said, okay, it's not legal again. So you can get absinthe. You can import it again into this country, and you have a lot of, especially micro distillers, who are making it again now. So, yeah.
Didn't they just only recently allow distilled spirit advertising back on TV? I was trying to figure out where that coincided.
Yeah.
Like 5 or 6 years ago?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't repeat the last question. This question here was, didn't they just allow distilled spirits advertising on TV? Distilled spirits advertising has actually always been allowed for TV. The debate over advertising has gone on since the 1930s when the WCTU and other organizations that were heavily involved in temperance wanted to stop all advertising altogether. Back in the 30s, it was all about radio advertising. And during Prohibition itself, the distillers really got in trouble because they were the ones, that's where the bootleggers were bringing in, right? You got so much more profit margin by bringing in a barrel of distilled spirits versus wine or beer. You can make a lot more cocktails with it, right? So the biggest stigma against alcohol was largely against spirits. And hence the distillers had to, once it became legal again to distill, they had kind of the toughest road to hoe. So they agreed, bless you, they agreed in the 1930s that they wouldn't advertise on television or radio. And that held all the way until 1996. And that's when the spirits really hit a low point. And at that point, the first company, that was Seagram's, said, okay, we have to advertise. This is just, we're losing too much market share to wine and craft beer. And so they broke the code and decided, we're going to start advertising on TV. Largely, you only see it on cable stations. there was actually I think on the Grammys this year, there were a couple of stations that were willing to host commercials. It's the recession going on right now, right? And a lot of stations are starving for advertising, and so more and more stations are willing to take distilled spirits advertising. But yeah, it was always just a gentleman's agreement. It was never illegal, and that certainly would ever pass constitutional muster ever to actually put a ban on alcohol advertising altogether.
There are some strange laws since the 70s, 80s. You're not allowed to show people drinking alcohol in the commercials.
That was actually more, the question was, could they actually ban alcohol drinking or not show? That was more of a code of practice. Over the years, the different brewers, it was largely the brewers who advertised on TV until the last decade or so. That was their code of conduct, that they couldn't show people drinking. So it was just a standard practice. Now, they show it all the time, certainly, right? And certainly lots of shows like Mad Men show lots of drinking going on. So there's been kind of a cultural shift over time. And again, I think partly they held on to okay, let's not show beer drinking because that'd be irresponsible to show drinking. Once I think the distillers got into the game of showing advertising on TV, then the brewers decided, okay, we're going to one-up them. Well, we're going to start showing people drinking and enjoying it, right? So it kind of goes along with it. But yeah, a lot of people think there's laws against showing different things or can't show different things on TV, but in fact, it was always just best practices. They were kind of a code of conduct that the different industry organizations had, and they've changed them over the last couple of years. They've really shored up quite a bit just within the last 3 or 4 years, starting with the distillers. They put some very heavy regulations in place, self-regulations in place, really to prevent any kind of advertising that kids might like. So, no Budweiser frogs, anything cartoon-based, you can't do it. No Santa Claus, no partial nudity, no mud wrestling, anything like that. And then the brewers then followed that and said, okay, we're going to raise the bar as well. Because otherwise it was sort of not so innocuous advertising they were using, really, especially the brewers, for the longest time.
I wanted to ask, how did you become interested in the history of alcohol?
Again, it was kind of that light bulb moment at my grandmother's place when how she responded so negatively. She got a little bit snooty about the fact I brought that bottle of wine to Christmas dinner. Like, what are you thinking, bringing a bottle of wine to Christmas dinner? You know I don't drink, kind of thing. And that's kind of when the light bulb went on. Like, wow, what happened here? Why didn't this value get passed on to my mom or to me? And that's when I started doing my research into this and discovered, wow, this is really uncharted waters. Like, nobody has covered this question. No one has framed the question or written a book about this. How we went from this country that stigmatized alcohol to where we are now. So, in a nutshell, that was kind of it. 6 years ago. Next book won't take as long, but yeah, the first time author, you got to figure out what the process is, and there's no one to coach you. You got to kind of make your own mistakes. So I'm thinking about calling the next book "Throwing Spaghetti at a Wall." That's what it feels like. Just trial and error. Some things work and some things don't. You just get up and try something else different. So I know within Google, I've heard a lot of people say that there's a big culture of if you're not failing, well, you're not trying hard enough. And I think the same thing is true for being an author, especially a first-time author. You got to be willing to fail. It's okay. You'll pick yourself back up and you'll try something else. Like either trying to sell the book to an agent or to a publisher, or even doing all the promotional events like I'm doing right now. Some events are blockbuster. Sometimes you get 4 people show up, and a lot of events are kind of in between. So I think every event has a little bit of a sacrifice RBI element to it, where as long as you're selling books, it's okay. It's okay to not have a huge audience or anything. So, you had a question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask what your thoughts are on the parallel between alcohol prohibition and marijuana prohibition currently.
Good question. Everyone asks this question here. We asked here kind of about the prohibition against alcohol versus the drug wars. And I didn't actually cover that at all in the book itself, but it's a very timely question. I think it's fascinating to point out the parallel or non-parallel between Prohibition and the drug wars of today. Even during Prohibition, and by the way, I think largely Prohibition and the drug wars are largely about enforcement, right? It's about trying to keep people from getting a hold of the product, but never deals with the ultimate question, the market side, the demand side of the equation. Why do people want to drink? Why do people want to get high? And ultimately, I think if people want to do it, they're going to do it. That's my fundamental conclusion. Even during Prohibition itself, this is really kind of shocking, personal possession of alcohol was never illegal. You could always have it in your home. You can make your own wine back during Prohibition, and many people did. All the 18th Amendment did was outlaw the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. But the temperance movement, at least give them some credit, they realized, okay, people are still want a certain amount of freedom still to drink in their own homes, and therefore it's not illegal to actually possess this stuff. You look at kind of the non-parallels of the drug wars today, where we've criminalized even possession. So hence we've filled our prisons full of people, largely low-level drug offenders. You know, most of these people are not drug lords and stuff. They're simply people who got caught a couple times smoking marijuana or whatever. And is that the best policy? Because incarcerating people is horribly expensive. And does it ever actually deal with the demand side of the equation? You know, when you can deal that with education, with treatment, or ultimately with licensing it. You know, a lot of people I know are getting more and more towards that point. Especially, I think my generation, Generation X, we're kind of libertarians, and people are sort of like, you know, shouldn't gay marriage be legal? Shouldn't, you know, alcohol be legal? Shouldn't marijuana be legal? You know, people have really changed their mindsets significantly in a lot of these social questions now in American society. So, yeah, it's definitely a relevant question here, and I think we'll see where that goes over the next few years, especially as more and more states adopt medical marijuana for use, and more and more people are finally kind of coming out as occasional tokers, you know.
Just one more quick question. Have you ever, going off that, maybe drawn the parallel to the movement that's getting a little more strong to, you know, restrict soda and other sugary beverages? Because if you think about that new advertising campaign in New York City where, you know, it shows them pouring a soda and it's just a bunch of fat in the glass and trying to get people to not drink soda.
Mm-hmm.
And do you kind of have the same opinion about the demand side, something like that?
I haven't really examined that question myself. I think certainly soda is probably one of the reasons why Americans, probably among other reasons why Americans are having such a big obesity epidemic in the country. And I think obesity is in fact our biggest by far, no pun intended, public health issue now. You know, Americans, our portion sizes are out of control. Americans drive everywhere now. You know, we don't exercise when we go to and from work, and we all sit at desks now. So it's a huge lifestyle question, I think, ultimately. But soda is certainly part of it. I haven't really myself examined the question of whether or not we should ban sodas in school or not. But actually, I personally stopped drinking sodas over a decade ago. But just more because I would get a big sugar rush, and then I would just collapse. And so I decided, okay, I'm not going to drink that anymore. I'll just drink, you know, good whiskey. Yes.
I have one more question. You mentioned that women didn't really start drinking until the 20s. I guess if you look back at the century preceding that in the 1800s, I mean, was it still predominantly men that drank? I mean, the rank and file, did women really not drink, you know, first couple hundred years of this country, or?
Yeah. The question was about women and drinking, and women didn't really start drinking until the 1920s in American society. But what was the role of women before then? And did women in fact drink? I think some women certainly did drink, but largely drinking was the purview of men. Because men at that point, they went to the saloon or the tavern. So they'd go outside of the house. And you know, where the temperance movement came from was this church-based response to the binge drinking that was going on. And if you look at it per capita, at the peak of the binge, which was about 1820, 1830, when there was no tax on whiskey at all, and it was everywhere, the actual per capita amount of alcohol, if you looked at just the men who were drinking at the time, it was about 8 times what we are drinking per capita today. I mean, a huge social issue. Men were drinking themselves to death. And yes, it was largely men, because they were the ones who would go out to the saloons and taverns, and women weren't welcome in taverns. You might have even seen at some places, like if you ever go to New York City, San Francisco, go to Elixir. It's in the Mission District, and I gave a talk there last week. And they had a separate entrance for women only. I think it's the second oldest saloon in the city, something 1850s sometime, because wives were allowed to go in there with a growler. Today there's a bottle called a growler. It's a big 4 pints, but back then a growler was a bucket, and the wives or kids would be sent to basically the service entrance of the bar, and they could go use this one entrance because the women weren't allowed inside the bar, and they would fill up the growler, and that was for home consumption. They would take it home for their husbands. So that was the only way women could, in fact, go inside of a bar, you know, including at that bar Elixir. Or New York City, there was a very, very famous bar up there called McSorley's, founded in the 1850s, an Irish bar, and women weren't allowed in there till around 1970 or so. So yeah, so we need to cut off. So, well, thanks so much here for your time here today. I really appreciate your time here for everybody, and hope that the talk was worthwhile, and hopefully it was fun. Thank you.